Aldana Cohen, is a writer and professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, where he directs the Socio-Spatial Climate Collaborative. He conducts qualitative and quantitative research on politics of climate change, social movements, and cities. His research and writing have appeared in publications including Nature, Public Culture, Metropolitics, and many others. He is the co-host of Hot and Bothered, a podcast on politics of climate change. He is also co-editor of Notes from Canada's Young Activists. Please welcome Daniel.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here at the Philadelphia Ethics Society. It's also my first time giving a Sunday address, so forgive any faux pas. So I want to start this talk with a basic idea, it comes from a New York City planner that I know called Joan Byron, who said to me, the two great existential crises of the 21st century, two great threats are one, climate change, and two, being kicked out of your home. And what I'm going to try to persuade you today is that these two threats are connected, but that they're connected in ways that we can actually feel good about. And I'm going to lean into the existential theme here quite a bit. The one kind of like basic premise of my talk that is just kind of essential is this idea that what causes climate change are greenhouse gas emissions, or carbon for short, right? And this is mainly what comes from burning fossil fuels, coal, gas, and oil. And climate change is bad. That is another premise. So let's just start by going to São Paulo, which is a city where I conduct a lot of my research. São Paulo is a metro region of 20 million people. The municipality has 11 million people. It is the largest city in South America and economic capital of South America. It's an extremely unequal city. Of those 11 million in the municipality, 3 million live with some form of housing insecurity. But São Paulo is a lot like many US cities in the sense that it has a vibrant downtown, which has a huge number of jobs, government jobs, informal market jobs, and this area has suffered extreme disinvestment. And as a result, it has had in the 2000s a vacancy rate for residential units of about 17%. So this is the kind of familiar story we know of a kind of once vibrant downtown suffering from disinvestment, a huge number of jobs, and working class people and poor people in the city often commute 4 hours a day from the periphery to the center and home, commuting by bus, while the wealthier residents also have kind of epic commutes, commuting by car. So you have the city with this giant spatial mismatch, one of the worst levels of congestion in the world, this disinvented downtown full of vacant buildings, and these buildings are often occupied by housing movements. And I want to tell you a bit about Ivaneci Araújo, who's a member of the most vibrant housing movement in downtown São Paulo. Ivaneci, when I met her a couple of summers ago, she is a black woman in her early 40s. She grew up in the rural part of São Paulo, in a poor working class family, and she ended up having a lot of odd jobs. She worked in sugarcane fields, cutting sugarcane, which was turned into ethanol. And she met a man, she had a couple of children, and like so many others, they moved into the city in order to have a better life. And she ended up working as a live-in domestic maid for a family downtown. And the room that she lived in was so moldy and unhealthy, she asked her boss if she could have a supplement so that she could rent a room nearby and not have to live in this room. And he said no, and he actually kicked her out, fired her on the spot. And she ended up on the street with her children for 3 months. In the course of this time, Ivaneci discovered the housing movement in downtown São Paulo. And the housing movement is composed of women like Ivaneci, almost exclusively women of color. She joined a group occupying a building in downtown São Paulo. And this building became the most important occupation in the city. The building was quite huge. Hundreds of families lived there. They had a meeting space, which doesn't look like this, but in some ways is functionally equivalent, where the major activist gatherings in the whole city throughout the 2000s and early 2010s were taking place. Ivaneci became the single most important housing organizer in downtown São Paulo. And one of the things that really strikes me about this story is that you see how much inequality can keep people like Ivaneci, mothers, from realizing their potential as humans. And it took a housing movement and the spell of homelessness to put her in a situation where all of her energy and all of her dynamism were able to really come out. So you have this movement occupying buildings downtown. And the biggest threat to their occupations, and they're demanding these buildings turn into public housing, the biggest threat to these occupations ends up being climate change. But not the physical effects of climate change, but climate policy. So Sao Paulo in the late 2000s has a mayor who wants to be like Michael Bloomberg was in New York City. He's a kind of sort of independent guy. He banned billboards from the center-right. And he thought, you know what, just like Mike Bloomberg, I want to have low-carbon policy in Sao Paulo. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to take this disinvented area of downtown, I'm going to make it much more dense, much more vibrant. I'm going to bring in a bunch of tech companies like IBM and a bunch of cultural organizations, and we're going to build a bunch of housing, and it's going to be a kind of new Paris in the center of Sao Paulo. And we will reduce congestion, increase kind of walkability, and we'll show the whole city of Sao Paulo that we can cut carbon emissions by having more people walking to work, more people walking to services, more people living in these dense kind of multi-family, multi-use situations, not that different from Central City in Philadelphia. And it wasn't just Sao Paulo. All around the world in the 2000s, mayors of big cities had this idea that we can slash carbon emissions and increase density at the same time. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to build centers of cities that are really friendly to the creative class, to professionals, and they are then going to go and teach the rest of society how to live well. The only problem is that people already lived in these downtown areas, often people of color, people who actually worked in the very spot where they already lived, and those people do not want to be displaced and do not want to be gentrified out of their areas. For them, this is like an existential concern, to defend their downtown living, or to defend their occupation. This is Mother's Day, and I think about something another woman in the housing movement in Sao Paulo said to me. She said, I was asking her why was it that the movement was so much a movement of women, the housing movement, and she told me something really interesting. She said, Daniel, the reason the housing movement in Brazil is led by women is because in Brazil, every woman holds in her heart the conviction that one day her man will leave her. And so he may fight about other things or go out into the world, she will defend her home. Right? This is the existential threat that these women face. So they fight very hard to protect their homes. And in Sao Paulo, the housing movement fought very hard against this climate-linked redevelopment of the downtown. And they won, actually. This movement's political ally, sort of center-left mayor, in some ways sort of similar to Jim Kenney, in other ways different. This guy had a PhD in philosophy. His dissertation was called Historical Materialism from Hegel to Habermas. But this mayor came in, and the first thing that he did with the support of housing movements was to cancel the redevelopment of the downtown. So this will seem like a kind of classic example of a conflict between, on the one hand, environmental policies coming from the top down, and on the other hand, a kind of movement for social justice coming from the bottom up. But what I want to kind of suggest or argue is that there's a different way of thinking about the story. If you think about the kind of downtown that the housing movements were actually fighting for, they were fighting for affordable housing, affordable density, public transportation, jobs and public services near where people lived. Now what's kind of remarkable is that if you go and look at the documents that the green policy elites of the world are circulating, when they talk about a low-carbon city, about density, about walkability, about livability, almost all the bullet points are the same. So you have on the one hand a group of people who go to global summits and talk about decarbonizing urban spaces with a set of prescriptions, but they're interested in kind of the creative class as the kind of cultural leaders of this. But then you also have all around the world housing movements that are fighting to protect density, fighting against gentrification. And those movements are making demands that are very, very, very similar. And if you look objectively at the kind of city that housing movements are trying to win, even though they don't talk about climate change, the actual urban form would be low carbon. Right? The two major causes of emissions in cities are cars and inefficient homes and buildings. And what the housing movements are demanding, which is dense housing, walkability, proximity to jobs, proximity to services, that actually adds up to a low-carbon city. And so what I want to argue, just the first kind of point, is that we should think about these movements who are not led by people we think about as being environmentalists. Not hippies and fanny packs who love the forest, but the people who live in central areas or who live near nodes of transit and housing. These people are accidental low-carbon protagonists. Now, it would be great if these movements embraced the politics of climate change. It would be great if they thought of themselves as being environmentalists, poor people's environmentalists, which is a phrase that gets thrown around. That would be great. But even before we think about what these groups should talk about, we need to recognize that objectively, accidentally, they already are low-carbon protagonists. Okay, now I want to pause, and we're going to come back to São Paulo. But first I want to say something about how did I actually end up in São Paulo in the first place, and why was I working on climate change. So I'm Canadian. Still don't even have my green card, but it's on the way, hopefully. I grew up in Toronto, and I grew up in a somewhat dour household. It was sort of shaped, the mood of the house was kind of shaped by these two genocides. The first was the Holocaust. My father was Jewish. And the second was the genocide in Guatemala in the early 1980s. My mother was Guatemalan. And we kind of talked constantly about death and genocide and politics. And I became obsessed with these things. But the books that are available for teenagers to read are books about the Holocaust, and I devoured them as a teenager. And they're these amazing books, and they're always stories where there's this kind of premonition and something horrible happens, and there's a family or a young boy or a young girl who has to escape. And what's kind of fascinating about these books, I think in retrospect, is how morally sophisticated they are, in the sense that in these books, it's not about a sort of choice between big systematic change versus like small local change, like we often hear about in politics. But just every life that can be saved is valued. And you sort of learn these heroic stories about families and individuals who go out of their way to save the lives of others. And we understand that the accumulation of these kind of heroic acts are really what make us human. I think a message very similar to what we were hearing earlier about the kind of premise of this society. Now I think that for me this might have been the sort of semi-abstract obsession that passed, but death in my family made this all very personal for me. First, my father's younger brother, when I was a child, my father's younger brother and my father's only sibling died of lung cancer. My father was a novelist, and he wrote a beautiful novel about this. And a few years after that, my father was diagnosed with lung cancer, and he died a year after that. I was still living at home, and I remember being with my family. I remember us washing my father's body, and I became, in the years after this, completely obsessed with death. And I became, as part of this, kind of obsessed with an idea of inevitability. That mortality is this logic of limits and of tipping points, and it's just where we're all going. And I had this idea of a kind of inevitability and a morbidity that followed me everywhere. I became a more serious person, and I think it was different people, of course, deal with death in different ways. And for a sort of relatively privileged middle-class white person, we don't live surrounded by death, but most people in the world obviously do, whether they're in poor communities, communities of color in the United States, virtually anywhere in the developing world. But for me, this was this kind of new and unique thing, and I was a cerebral person, so I dealt with this a lot by reading. And in university, I sort of learned a lot about kind of historical memory, with the history in particular of Latin America, terrorism, genocide, repression, and about the Holocaust. And this idea of kind of inevitability really stuck with me. So one book that I remember very clearly from that period, I want to tell you a little bit about. It's this book called The Natural History of Destruction by a German writer called W.G. Sebald. And it's actually a book about the German experience of the Second World War. And I remember this book so clearly because it seemed to dramatize and to exemplify so much this idea about the kind of tragic inevitability of history and its morbidity. The first part of the book is about the horrific firebombing of German cities during World War II. There are very visceral passages about the remains of bodies that were destroyed when temperatures would go up as high as 1,000 degrees during this firebombing. And then after this long discussion of this bombing, Sebald kind of argues that this was almost inevitable because a war machine had been kind of unleashed, and the logic of a war machine is that it can only lead towards death. Later in the book, there's a description of a German writer who had been tortured by the Gestapo called Jean Méry, and who resisted. And it's an interesting essay. What Sebald argues is that this author could understand, because he had faced death in the form of torture, he could understand in a way so few other Germans could understand that the murderous violence of the Nazi regime wasn't an accidental feature of authoritarianism, but that it was the whole point of authoritarianism, that there was this kind of like fundamental logic that could only go in one direction. So kind of once you tip into authoritarianism, it all falls apart. And I think those of us paying attention to the news today have also this fear that there is this kind of inevitable tipping point. Now, the reason I talk about all this is because when I really started to learn and to think about climate change, it was in this framework where I was seeing these kind of like morbid, inevitable logics. And I don't think I'm the only person who encounters climate change from the point of view of this framework of a kind of inevitability that goes along with a serious way of thinking. So the text that really made me decide to spend the rest of my life working on climate change, and I don't think I'm the only one who experienced this, was a series of essays by Elizabeth Colbert in The New Yorker that appeared in 2005 or 2006, and that are now collected in a beautiful book called Field Notes from a Catastrophe, which I assigned to my students. And there are these amazing essays about climate change, and the most important idea in them that's so gripping is this idea of tipping points, or feedback mechanisms, in the climate system. And what this means is there's a kind of point of no return in various aspects of the climate system. And I'll give you an example of one of them. There's an example that she talks about is the albedo effect. So the idea is that when sun and with light energy hits ice, sea ice, it bounces off, and almost none of that heat is captured. But as the ice melts in the Arctic, more and more the sunlight is hitting the dark ocean water. And because the ocean water is dark, it absorbs the heat and the energy. And that then melts the ice around it. And so you will eventually get a shift in state from predominant ice to predominant seawater. And it's an irreversible shift. And there's a kind of non-linear change that happens. And there are a whole bunch of other feedback mechanisms in the climate system. And it's because of these feedback mechanisms that we have this metaphor of runaway climate change. This idea that if we get past a certain point, we're past the point of no return, and there's no going back. And so I think that for me, like so many others, when we learn this about climate change, we just start to feel like it is inevitable. And people use metaphors and they talk to me all the time, like the train has left the station. You know, there's no turning back. It's already too late. We're already doomed. And in this logic, and Elizabeth Colbert does traffic in this, I think, there's a kind of melancholia to it. The only question really is, are we just going to be moral and do the right thing and fight against it without expecting to win, but just thinking it's the right thing to do? But this is a very, very paralyzing perspective. One sort of accepts the logic of inevitability because we're serious. We know what it's like when something bad starts. There's a certain logic to it. And then we may resist it, but we resist it without expecting to win. And we think that an optimistic perspective is somehow unserious, or is just kind of like a pep talk that doesn't mean anything. But as I learned about climate change and sort of got devoted to working on it, I started to wonder if this perspective I had was maybe too simple. And as my father's death receded, I think my mind kind of loosened up. I spent almost a year in Bolivia between college and graduate school, doing research there as a journalist on sort of indigenous movements that had helped to build toward the election of Evo Morales, the first indigenous leader ever elected in South America. And what I found was I met people from all walks of life, workers, indigenous working class people, middle class people who had fought. And I saw this kind of like beyond the headlines. It wasn't perfect, but it was pretty good. And it was a kind of continuous struggle. And when you read about this kind of thing in the news or in history, you have these like giant historical ruptures. But as I learned the stories of people who had grown coca leaves or were organized in cities, there's a very long incremental history that builds and builds and builds before you get this radical change that makes it possible for people to kind of improve their lives, to build better connections with each other. And as I learned more about the story in Guatemala and learned more about what was happening in Bolivia, I started to go back and reread in a way to rethink what I had thought I learned about genocide and about World War II. And I went back to Sebald's book and I realized this wasn't just a story about inevitable logics. It was a story about how very bad things can happen, but they are not everything. Hamburg, which is the city he describes the most in this book, is actually a thriving city now. And the story of this person who resisted torture is a story of resistance. And it's the accumulation of these acts that ultimately puts an end to processes like genocide and war. And I even remember to Sebald at the end, he quotes this passage by Walter Benjamin, but I want to quote to you a different passage by Walter Benjamin. He was a Jewish critic who actually died trying to escape the Nazis. But Benjamin, in an essay in Art, he writes, "Mankind, which in Homer's time was an object of contemplation for the Olympian gods, now is longing for itself. Its self-alienation has reached such a degree that it can experience its own destruction as an aesthetic pleasure of the first order." And he's talking about fascism, and what he's saying is it is very dangerous when people start to take aesthetic pleasure in the idea of the destruction of humans. And now when I read so much science fiction about climate change, and I read so much about how we're all doomed, I sense this danger, that there is a kind of fascination with the apocalypse that is coming, and that fascination actually makes it impossible to see a more incremental story, which is also a much more hopeful story, of us fighting back against climate change, and of more people being involved in this fight than we initially realized. So as a graduate student, I went to Sao Paulo, and we're coming back to Sao Paulo now. Sao Paulo was one of the few cities in the global south that had been tackling climate change. I didn't really know what it meant, but I wanted to know what was going on. I wanted to learn Portuguese. I had this idea that there was something outside of the newspapers and outside of New York where I was living that was interesting. And so I told you about UTNE and this housing movement that I've been tracking for the last almost 10 years. And when we left Sao Paulo, I was saying that this housing movement in Sao Paulo, it was a kind of accidental low-carbon protagonist. That they were decarbonizing the city and what they were fighting for, but they were doing so without thinking about it. But I actually left out a pretty important part of the story. So by the late 2000s, one of UTNE's comrades, somebody called Manuel Del Rio, is another leader of the housing movement. Now this guy has a very interesting history. He was a migrant from the northeast of Brazil, and in the 1980s, during the sort of fight to overturn the dictatorship in Brazil, Manuel Del Rio was a labor organizer. He organized textile workers in downtown Sao Paulo. And it's the beginning of it's in the 1980s when he's organizing these textile workers that the process of gentrification begins. Manuel Del Rio realizes, wait a minute, all these workers are being pushed further and further and further away from their work, which is something we know also from cities in the United States. But he had an interesting way of thinking about it. He said if the working day is getting longer because the commute is getting longer, then this longer commute is a form of wage theft. And it's actually like a labor issue for workers to be pushed further and further and further from where they work. He had this very holistic and dynamic way of thinking. And he wrote a pamphlet called Housing and Salary, It's the Same Struggle. And he switched his organizing. He left the labor movement and joined the housing movement because he could see how integrated these issues were. And he thought the number one way to defend working people was to defend their right to housing, which is quite visionary if you think now about the housing crisis all over the world. And so in the late 2000s, when he started hearing about this idea of a low-carbon city, and that the low-carbon city was all the professional class, creative class people going downtown, he said, wait a minute, that's not right. The low-carbon city is a city where working class and poor people live near their jobs, near public services, in the centers of cities, and in other nodes in the city where they have these kinds of qualities and these kinds of services. So he started writing in the late 2000s about this. And actually his housing movement began producing pamphlets and training its members in talking about the links between sustainability and housing in terms of carbon and also in terms of resistance to, in Sao Paulo, or droughts and flooding. So actually it's not just a kind of deduction from a scholarly point of view, this idea that poor people's movements are kind of integral leaders in building a climate-friendly city. But actually you see it even in Sao Paulo, on the ground, this movement taking up this idea that they are themselves environmental protagonists, even though they don't look anything like the environmental activists that they're used to seeing on TV, which in Sao Paulo, much like here, we sort of imagine a kind of a Sierra Club type situation. And actually Brazil does not have anything like the environmental justice movement that you have in the United States. So really visionary transformation, and I've seen amazing things. I went to a workshop where they talked about compost toilets. The women were very tickled by this idea, actually. It's pretty funny. You have kind of an anarchist sort of toilet engineer talking to all these women who had come from a housing occupation and trying to explain to them that they could disconnect the toilets from the grid and just compost the earth and grow food into it. They weren't entirely convinced, but they thought it was a pretty interesting idea. During the terrible drought in Sao Paulo, the members of the housing movement actually reached out and connected with environmentalists and started building rainwater collection cisterns so they collect some meager rainwater during the drought. And you see, again, another version of a kind of environmentalism from below, led by this housing movement. And at the same time, with this new leftist mayor, you had a shift in the idea of what a kind of more energy-efficient city would be, from instead of focusing on creative workers downtown, instead the idea was to densify the whole city by having corridors where you built up density built up public transportation, and included affordable housing all throughout these corridors. So you shift from a kind of almost like trickle-out effect, focused only on the downtown and on creatives and on young people, to a systematic vision that is about improving the quality of life all over the city, and that is prioritizing housing justice the whole way, thanks to the pressure of the housing movements. So this is actually a story of a shift in climate politics in cities from a carbon-centric focus and a middle-class-centric focus to a much more social and holistic perspective. This is a shift you're seeing all over the world. The other city that I pay attention to, that I've done a ton of research on, is New York City. And in New York City, you are seeing, amazingly, very, very similar story. In New York City, in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, housing groups, labor groups, and community groups get together and say, climate change is the thing. We are no longer leaving this to the Bloombergs of the world. We're going to build our own vision for a low-carbon city. In New York City, this vision has much more to do with, yes, defending affordable housing, building energy retrofits that prioritize jobs for working class people and people of color in the neighborhoods where these buildings are being retrofit, public transportation as well. And one of the amazing things about the New York City story is that these movements based in cities, environmental justice movement, labor movement, community groups, they don't even want to stop in New York City. They've gone out into New York State, built connections with rural communities and environmental justice communities upstate, and said we have to transform the entire state. We need a politics of investment that taxes fossil fuels and that uses that revenue to directly invest in improvements to clean energy and to community infrastructure in the poorest and most racialized communities all across this state. Now, I don't think this is a story that has really gone now, but it speaks to a kind of change in logic. So when I talk about the reincarnation of the low-carbon city, what I want to mean is a shift, again, from a very narrow perspective to a much richer perspective, and also to a perspective that is okay with us moving a little bit slowly, but building a broad social base and understanding that social justice, racial justice, economic justice, all of these are the same thing in a way as climate justice. So instead of seeing inequality and climate change as two problems to be balanced, or the housing threat and the climate threat as two threats that have to be held kind of in tension, we now see them as literally the same thing. And we have to just simply be creative and deliberate in forging a politics and a set of policies and telling a set of stories that advance solutions on both fronts together. Now, this still might sound kind of like a lot of stories. Now, we're not doing PowerPoint presentation today because we're not at the university. So I just have to tell you what it would be like if we were doing a PowerPoint presentation. So I direct something called the Socio-Spatial Climate Collaborative, and I'm working with actually the best carbon footprint analyst in the country right now. And we've done some preliminary research, and we're doing more research on doing carbon footprints at the neighborhood level. And this is where you kind of include the full consumption portfolio of the household in analyzing the carbon footprint of that neighborhood. And what we find is really very simple. The neighborhoods that have the lowest carbon footprint and the highest quality of life tend to be mixed income neighborhoods anchored with affordable housing. And you can see this on a map we've done in New York where we literally show the NYCHA, the public housing buildings, anchored by affordable housing with public services, with jobs, with public transit. The wealthiest neighborhoods, like the neighborhoods in Manhattan that are celebrated for the density, the people in them spend so much money on airplane tickets and buy so much stuff that their personal consumption totally outweighs the benefits of density. The poorest neighborhoods, the poorest families, of course, need to consume more. Of course they need to consume more. But where you find that sweet spot of livability, levels of consumption that lead to a very good life and a low carbon footprint, these are not neighborhoods like actually Center City or Society Hill. You think further down, like into South Philly, parts of West Philly. In New York, you think of parts of Brooklyn, parts of Queens, parts of the Bronx. It's not Hong Kong, it's not Manhattan, but this is sort of like democratic urban fabric that's been built up actually slowly over time by community groups, by unions, by racial justice groups, by progressive clergy organizations that have built libraries and schools and union halls and many of these kinds of public facilities. And these are what make it possible to live a life where you exchange symbols instead of objects and where everyday life is, in a way, civilized and it's low carbon. So there's a beautiful phrase by the urbanist Mike Davis. He says, "The cornerstone of the low carbon city, far more than any particular green design or technology, is the priority given to public affluence over private wealth. And what's been so great about this carbon emissions accounting that we're doing is we're putting up numbers that show that this is the case. So it's not just the case, actually, that the housing movements and their allies are building another low-carbon city. They're building a lower carbon city. And it's actually ironic that for so long we thought that kind of creative, professional class consumers would be the avatars or the kind of forerunners of the low-carbon city, when in fact, their consumption is really the problem. They are sort of the opposite of the model of the low-carbon city. The model of the low-carbon city is what we all know to be the history of these cities in the United States, the kind of democratic history, which is community groups, labor groups, housing movements and others building a public sector and a public city full of public spaces. And it's that public affluence that makes it possible to live well, and will make it possible to live well in the 21st century in a safe way. So, this is a more complex vision of the low-carbon city, and it has more moving parts, but those moving parts are what we would call people and communities. And I think this should make us optimistic. I want to say one more thing about the science. So, I've spent a lot of time now talking with scientists, and on my podcast called Hot and Bothered, but be careful how you Google it, because you might have something to go on. I talk at length with Michael Mann. He's one of the most important climate scientists in the world. He's a professor at Penn State. We go in very sort of in detail through a number of these feedback mechanisms and tipping points. And I talk with other climate scientists about this, and they all say the same thing. They say there are these tipping points. The situation is extremely dangerous. We have not crossed most of them yet. It is not too late to prevent the worst of climate change. And they all say we just don't know exactly how the climate is going to change, at exactly what level. But what we know, what every climate scientist knows, is that every bit of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas that you don't put in the atmosphere saves lives. Like every inch of sea level that you avoid makes it safer to live in Philadelphia, in New York, in Ho Chi Minh City, in Dhaka, all around the world, in Shanghai, in Beijing. Every little bit makes a difference. It's the same as what we know from genocide, is that every life you save is worthwhile. Every bit of carbon that we don't emit saves lives, and it is worthwhile. And we don't know where the tipping points are. We don't know exactly how bad it will get, but we do know the things that we can do to keep it from getting really bad. And I think we've been trapped in this sort of black and white idea with these metaphors of runaway and of tipping points, that there's a kind of sense of doom that's already here, and that nothing we do really makes a big difference. But everything that we do makes a big difference. It's all worth doing. And it's especially exciting that more and more movements are discovering this as well and are engaging in this. So people will die, and we know that. And that is bad. But imagine if Ivonette in São Paulo had not joined the housing movement, just because some of her friends in the street didn't make it. At the same time, we see now in the United States movements for black lives, movements for indigenous lives, housing movements, labor movement, now with the teacher strikes, all over the country, actually, movements of people rising up, and more of those people embracing climate change as one of their key issues. And the amazing coincidence is this is happening right as the kind of richest people in the world are talking about investing $1 trillion a year in climate-friendly investments in the built environment. And so there's this conjuncture of an idea that everybody has who's not in the US Republican Party. That we need to pour money into transforming our built environment, to transforming our infrastructure to deal with climate change, on the one hand, this need to spend money on this issue, and on the other hand, an upsurge of social movements demanding that money be invested in a way that enhances social justice, that protects people from extreme weather, and that builds a cleaner energy economy. So, because of this convergence, I actually now wake up every morning feeling good about our prospects for defeating climate change. And I feel that when I think now about history and about the 20th century, I don't think about an inevitability of death, but I think about these stories of life and protecting life, and how the accumulation of these stories really can build us a better world and a safer world in the decades ahead. Thank you.